Picture a hillside in Galilee, not a cathedral, not a church with stained glass and stone columns. A hillside, grass and dust and open sky. A small group of people standing around a man they have been following for months. One of them asks a simple question, "Teach us how to pray." And the man answers, in Aramaic, in a language that most of the world has never heard this prayer in words that no surviving manuscript has ever recorded exactly as he spoke them. What came out of that moment became the most widely spoken prayer in human history. 2 billion people carry some version of it today. It has been said at bedsides and gravesides, in cathedrals and foxholes, in languages that did not exist when it was first spoken. You have probably said it yourself. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Most people who grow up in the Christian world learn these words before they learn long division. The prayer is that early, that deep. For many, it is the first complete thing they ever memorized. But here is a question almost no one thinks to ask. What did those words sound like before they were those words? Not the King James Version. Not the Latin your grandparents may have known. Not the Greek text that every translation goes back to. What were the sounds in the actual language that came out of the mouth of the man who first taught this prayer on that hillside? Because here is what we know. The language of that hillside was Aramaic, a Semitic language, ancient, layered, built on roots and resonances that Greek and Latin and English carry only partially, and sometimes not at all. So what happens when a prayer travels? When it moves from a living Aramaic voice into written Greek, from Greek into Latin, from Latin into English, across 2,000 years of translation and tradition and liturgy. Some things survive the journey very well. Some things become harder to hear, and some things, when you finally listen for them, turn out to have been there all along, underneath the words you already know. That is what this is about, not a decoding, not a correction, a journey back toward the voice that first gave this prayer its shape, and forward into a richer way of hearing the one you already carry. Chapter 1. The world the prayer was born into. To understand what this prayer may have sounded like before it became the prayer you know, you have to understand the world it came from, not the world of church councils and theological debates, the world of a specific place and a specific time, a region called Galilee, the 1st century of the Common Era. And that world was far more complicated than most people imagine. Galilee was not an isolated backwater. It sat at the intersection of major trade routes connecting Syria to Egypt, east to west, north to south. Merchants passed through it. Roman soldiers were stationed near it. The city of Sepphoris, a fully Hellenized urban center with mosaic floors and a Roman-style theater, sat less than 4 miles from the village of Nazareth. 4 miles, a morning's walk from where Jesus grew up, which means that Jesus of Nazareth did not grow up in a bubble. He grew up inside a collision of cultures, and inside a collision of languages. 3 languages were in active use in this world. The first was Aramaic, the everyday spoken language of the vast majority of Jewish people living in Palestine at the time. The language of the home, the market, the street. It had been the dominant spoken language of the region for centuries. When a farmer in Galilee argued with his neighbor, when a mother called her children in from the fields, when a teacher sat with his students, the language was Aramaic. The second was Hebrew, not dead, but increasingly a language of sacred and formal contexts. The Torah was read in Hebrew. Certain prayers were recited in Hebrew. A teacher like Jesus would have known it. But Hebrew in the first century was not the language of daily life for most ordinary people in Galilee. It was the language of the texts they revered. The third was Greek, Koine Greek, the simplified common dialect that had spread across the Mediterranean world following the conquests of Alexander the Great 3 centuries earlier. The language of Roman administration, international trade, and civic life. Whether Jesus spoke it fluently or only minimally is something scholars continue to discuss. But he lived within reach of it every day. Now here is the point that matters for everything that follows. Across the full range of scholars who have examined this question, those who approach the Gospels with deep historical skepticism and those who approach them from inside the faith, there is broad agreement. When Jesus taught his disciples, when he sat with them and gave them a model for how to pray, he was almost certainly speaking Aramaic. Matthew Black, whose study an Aramaic approach to the Gospels and Acts, published in 1967, demonstrated systematically that many of the teachings of Jesus preserved in the Greek Gospels carry the fingerprints of Aramaic composition underneath. The rhythms, the parallelisms, the wordplays that do not quite work in Greek but come alive when you reconstruct the Aramaic behind them. Joachim Jeremias, the German New Testament scholar, whose work on the prayers of Jesus is still cited decades after his death, spent much of his career showing how deeply rooted Jesus was in the Aramaic prayer tradition of first-century Judaism. The Greek text of the Lord's Prayer is real, but in many places it is a translation, and behind it, something older is breathing. There is one more thing you need to know about this world before we follow the prayer forward. Jesus did not teach in a vacuum. He taught inside a living tradition of Jewish prayer. And when he gave his disciples a model for addressing God, he was drawing on vocabulary and structures his listeners already carried in their bones. Scholars have long noted how closely the opening movement of the Lord's Prayer resembles the Kaddish, an ancient Jewish prayer still recited in synagogues around the world today. The Kaddish begins by asking that God's great name be magnified and sanctified, then moves toward a petition for the coming of God's kingdom. Sound familiar? Jesus was not copying the Kaddish. He was teaching people to pray in a language they already understood, using the deep grammar of Jewish devotion that had been shaping how his people addressed God for generations. When you know that, the Lord's Prayer does not become less original. It becomes more grounded, a prayer that grew out of real soil, real tradition, real communal memory. And that is the world we are leaving behind as we follow this prayer forward into the text we actually have, because that text raises its own fascinating questions, starting with the fact that we do not have one version of this prayer. We have two. Chapter 2. The text we have. Most people who grew up praying the Lord's Prayer assume there is one version of it, one original, one definitive text that every translation goes back to. There are two, and the differences between them are not minor. The first version is in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 6, verses 9 through 13. The longer version, the one most people know, it contains the full address, the petitions for bread and forgiveness and deliverance, and ends with the doxology, "For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever. Amen." This is the version that entered the liturgy of the Western Church, the version that went into the Book of Common Prayer, into the Catholic Mass, into the memory of nearly every Christian in the Western world. The second version is in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 11, verses 2 through 4, noticeably shorter. In many of the oldest manuscripts, it reads simply, "Father, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Give us each day our daily bread, and forgive us our sins, for we ourselves forgive everyone who is indebted to us. And lead us not into temptation. Know who art in heaven. Know thy will be done." No doxology. Same prayer, different shape. Which one is closer to what Jesus actually said? Most scholars who have examined this carefully believe the shorter Luke version may preserve an earlier form. The reasoning is straightforward. In the transmission of texts, material tends to get added for liturgical use, not subtracted. Communities that repeated this prayer in worship naturally developed it toward a fuller, more ceremonially satisfying form. Matthew's version reflects a prayer that had already been shaped by communal use. Luke's version, simpler and more direct, may be closer to the original teaching moment. But this is not a settled question. Both versions have serious scholarly defenders. What the differences tell us is this: this prayer was alive from its very beginning, being used, being shaped by the communities that prayed it, leaving different fingerprints in different places. That is not a problem. That is evidence of a prayer doing exactly what prayers are supposed to do. Now, that doxology at the end of Matthew's version. "For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever. Amen." The part that fills out the prayer so beautifully at the close, the part that most Protestant Christians say every Sunday, it does not appear in the oldest Greek manuscripts of Matthew's Gospel. The Codex Sinaiticus, one of the oldest and most complete manuscripts of the New Testament we possess, dating to the 4th century, does not include it. Neither does the Codex Vaticanus. The doxology appears to have entered the text from a document called the Didache, a Greek word meaning teaching, one of the earliest Christian writings outside the New Testament, possibly composed as early as the late 1st century. The Didache instructs Christian communities to pray the Lord's Prayer 3 times daily and ends it with a version of the doxology. It was a liturgical addition, a community completing the prayer in worship, and it works so beautifully that it eventually became part of the prayer itself. Bruce Metzger, whose textual commentary on the Greek New Testament is the standard reference for questions like this, addresses the doxology directly. His conclusion, a later addition, not part of the original text, but he is also careful to note something important. The communities that added it were not corrupting the prayer. They were completing it, returning the language of petition to the language of praise. This is the first moment in our journey where we see the prayer being shaped by the hands of the people who prayed it. It will not be the last. But there is one more detail in this Greek text that deserves its own moment. It is a single word. In the petition, "Give us this day our daily bread." The word translated as daily in English is the Greek word epiousios. It appears almost nowhere else in the entire body of ancient Greek literature. Not in Homer, not in Plato, not in the Greek translations of the Hebrew Scriptures, not in the thousands of papyrus documents discovered in Egypt that give us a window into everyday Greek usage in the ancient world. as a descriptor for bread. Epiousios appears in surviving literature almost exclusively in this prayer. Origen, the 3rd century Christian scholar and one of the greatest Greek minds of his era, wrote explicitly that he had never encountered this word in any other source. He believed the Gospel writers may have coined it themselves, a word invented to translate something that did not translate cleanly. Scholars call this a hapax legomenon, a word that occurs only once in a known corpus, and in a text as widely copied as the New Testament. That is a signal. Something unusual is happening here. What does it mean? 3 serious proposals have been debated for centuries. Daily, bread for the current day, bread for ordinary sustenance. The most common translation and the most straightforward reading, for tomorrow, bread for the coming day, the assurance of tomorrow's provision. Supersubstantial, bread that transcends ordinary nourishment, bread of a spiritual or eschatological kind. Jerome used this translation when he rendered Matthew into Latin for the Vulgate in the late 4th century. Interestingly, he translated the same word as daily in his Latin version of Luke. He apparently saw both possibilities in the same Greek word and chose differently depending on context. John Meyer, in the 2nd volume of his monumental work, A Marginal Jew, examines this word carefully. His conclusion: the difficulty is genuine and unresolved. We do not know with certainty what epiousios means, and here is what that uncertainty may be telling us. Many scholars believe the difficulty the Greek translators had with this word reflects a difficulty that was there from the very beginning, that the Aramaic or Hebrew expression Jesus used did not map cleanly onto any existing Greek word. That epiousios may be a Greek writer's best attempt to capture something that the original language carried more naturally. The translation problem we encounter today may be the same translation problem the first translators encountered. What the prayer is clearly doing, whatever the precise word means, is asking for enough, not abundance, not a guarantee against future need. Enough for today, the posture of open hands, daily, renewed each morning. Anyone familiar with the story of manna in the wilderness would have heard that echo immediately. Each day, enough for that day. No storing, no hoarding. Come back tomorrow. That is not just a petition. It is a practice, and it may be one of the things this prayer was always asking of the people who said it. We have now looked carefully at the Greek text we have. 2 versions, a doxology added by worshipping communities, a word so unusual that Origen in the 3rd century had never seen it anywhere else. Before we go phrase by phrase through the prayer itself, there is one more question we need to answer. If Jesus spoke Aramaic, why do we only have this prayer in Greek? Chapter 3. The Journey into Greek. It is a fair question, and it deserves an honest answer. Jesus spoke Aramaic. His closest disciples spoke Aramaic. The earliest followers of the movement he started were, for the most part, Aramaic-speaking Jewish people living in Palestine, and yet the Gospels were written in Greek. Why? The answer has nothing to do with hiding something. It has everything to do with where the movement went. Within decades of Jesus' death, the communities that formed around his memory were no longer confined to Palestine. They were in Antioch, in Corinth, in Ephesus, in Rome, and in every one of those cities. The common language was not Aramaic. It was Greek, Koine Greek, the lingua franca of the entire Mediterranean world, the language that a merchant in Alexandria and a soldier in Athens and a freedman in Rome could all use to speak to each other. Writing the Gospels in Greek was not a betrayal of the Aramaic world Jesus came from. It was a decision to carry the story as far as it could go. But every act of translation is also an act of interpretation, wort by wort, phrase by phrase. The writers of the Gospels made choices. Which Greek word came closest to the Aramaic meaning? What to carry forward? What, inevitably, could not be carried in the same form? And here is what makes those choices visible. They did not always translate everything. There are moments in the Greek Gospels where the writers stop, and instead of translating, they preserve the original Aramaic word, carry it forward untouched. And those moments tell you something important about which words the earliest communities felt could not survive translation without losing something essential. The first example is Abba. In the Garden of Gethsemane, in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 14, verse 36, as Jesus prays in the darkest moment before his arrest, the Greek text does not translate his words. It preserves the Aramaic directly. Abba, Father, both words, the Aramaic first, then the Greek beside it, as if the writer knew that Father alone would not be enough. The second example is Talitha Kumi. In Mark chapter 5, verse 41, when Jesus raises the daughter of a synagogue leader, the Greek text stops and preserves the Aramaic, Talitha Kumi. Then it translates, Little girl, I say to you, arise. The writer could have given only the translation. Instead, the Aramaic is there, as if someone who was present remembered the exact sound of those words and could not bring themselves to let only a translation stand in their place. The third example is the cry from the cross. In Matthew chapter 27, verse 46, Jesus speaks, and the Greek text gives his words in Aramaic before translating them. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? The original language, right there in the middle of a Greek text. And the fourth is Maranatha. Paul, writing to a Greek-speaking community in a Greek city, closes with an Aramaic phrase without translating it. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 22, Maranatha, come, Lord. He assumes they will know it, because this word, in its Aramaic form, had already become part of the living vocabulary of early Christian prayer across language lines. What do these examples tell us? The writers of the New Testament were not trying to erase the Aramaic world. They were making deliberate choices. The words they chose to preserve untranslated tend to be words of extraordinary intimacy, or extraordinary weight, or extraordinary urgency. Words where the sound itself carried, meaning that translation could only approximate, which raises the question we are now ready to ask directly. When the Lord's Prayer was translated into Greek, what choices were made? What did the crossing into a different language make harder to hear? Before we go there, one thing must be said with complete clarity. There is no Aramaic manuscript of the Lord's Prayer. There is no document, no papyrus, no stone inscription that preserves the Lord's Prayer in the Aramaic words Jesus actually spoke. That text does not exist. Scholars cannot reconstruct it with certainty. Anyone who presents you with the original Aramaic Lord's Prayer as if it were a discovered artifact is overstating what the evidence allows. Full stop. What scholars can do, and what careful researchers have done productively for generations, is something more modest and more honest. They can examine the Greek text in light of what we know about Aramaic vocabulary and grammar. They can look at parallel expressions in Jewish prayer literature of the period. They can consult the Syriac tradition, which we will come to shortly, and they can ask, given all of that, what layers of meaning might be present in this prayer that are harder to hear once it has crossed into Greek? That is a legitimate question. It has real answers, carefully bounded by what the evidence actually supports. And it is the question we are taking into the next section. One more thing before we do. You need to know that a witness exists, not a competing version, not a lost original, a witness. The Syriac tradition. Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic, the closest surviving relative of the language Jesus most likely spoke. The Christian communities of Syria and Mesopotamia received the gospel very early in a language from the same family as the one Jesus used. Their principal Bible, the Peshitta, is an ancient and continuously living scriptural tradition, in unbroken use for somewhere between 17 and 19 centuries. Communities in Iraq, in Syria, in southern India, in diaspora congregations across the United States today, still read from it. The Peshitta is not the original words of Jesus. It is a translation, like the Greek, but because it translates into a language from the same Semitic family, it sometimes preserves nuances that the Greek translation, crossing a much larger linguistic gap, could not carry in the same way. We will spend real time with that witness later. Right now, we are ready to go through this prayer, phrase by phrase, slowly, with everything we now know standing behind each word. Chapter 4. Phrase by phrase. We are going to move slowly through this prayer, not because the words are difficult. You already know them. But familiar words are sometimes the hardest to actually hear. We stop registering them as language. They become sound, comfortable, habitual sound, and something gets lost in that comfort. So we slow down and listen again. Our Father, who art in heaven, 2 words, open this prayer. Our Father. In the Greek text of Matthew, Pater Haimon, Father of us. Simple, direct. 2 words that have opened this prayer for 2,000 years, in languages spanning every continent on earth. But we know something about what may have stood behind those Greek words. We know that in Gethsemane, in the most unguarded moment recorded in any gospel, Jesus did not say Pater, he said Abba, the Aramaic word that Mark preserved without translating because, apparently, Father alone was not sufficient. Jeremiah's argued. After a careful study of Jewish prayer literature from the period, that addressing God as Abba in the direct, unguarded way Jesus used it was without close parallel in the Jewish prayer tradition of the time. It is worth noting that this specific claim has been debated since, with scholars like James Barr questioning how unique the usage actually was. The honest position is that the evidence supports Abba as carrying a quality of intimacy, though how unusual that intimacy was remains a matter of ongoing scholarly discussion. What is not in dispute is this: the word Abba is warmer than potter, more immediate, less ceremonial. When Mark preserved it untranslated in Gethsemane, something was being protected, a texture that the Greek equivalent could not fully hold. So when the Lord's Prayer opens with Our Father, what may be underneath that word? In the world the prayer came from, is something closer to reaching than to addressing, not a formal invocation of a distant sovereign, something more like a child finding a hand in the dark. That changes the opening note of the prayer, not its meaning, its temperature. Hallowed be thy name, hallowed be thy name. In Greek, hagias theto to onomasou, let your name be made holy. Here is what you need to know about the word name in the Semitic world. In Hebrew and Aramaic, the word for name, Shem, in Hebrew, is not a label. It carries the full weight of identity, character, and presence. When the Hebrew scriptures speak of the name of God, they are talking about the totality of who God is and how God is known in the world. To hallow the name is not to treat a word with reverence. It is to ask that the reality of who God is be recognized and honored in the world as it actually is. E. P. Sanders, whose work on Judaism in the period of Jesus remains foundational, has noted how closely the opening movement of the Lord's Prayer resembles the Kaddish, the ancient Jewish prayer that opens by asking that God's great name be magnified and sanctified, then moves toward a petition for the coming of God's kingdom. Jesus was not copying the Kaddish. He was teaching inside a living tradition, using language his listeners already knew in their bones. Hallowed be thy name is not an archaic phrase that needs modernizing. It is a petition with a specific meaning. May the reality of who you are be known and recognized in this world. May the gap between what you are and what the world acknowledges close, even a little, even now. That is not a small request. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. This is the pivot of the entire prayer. Everything before it is address and praise. Everything after it is petition. This is the hinge. The Greek word translated as kingdom is basileia. In ordinary Greek usage, it refers to a realm, a territory, a domain of rule, but the Aramaic word behind it, malkuta, carries a different center of gravity, less about a place, more about an active reality, not kingdom as a geographic domain, but reign as something arriving, something breaking through. N.T. Wright, whose work on Jesus and the Jewish world of the first century is among the most detailed available, has written extensively about how first-century Jewish listeners would have heard language about God's kingdom, not primarily as a promise about the afterlife, as a claim about the present world, that God's ordering of reality was breaking through into history, not eventually, now, or at least beginning now. Thy kingdom come in that context is not a passive wish, it is urgent. And then the next phrase does something characteristic of Semitic poetry. It says the same thing again, from a different angle. Thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Scholars call this parallelism. Two lines that do not add new information, but deepen the same idea from two directions. The kingdom comes when the will is done. The will being done is what the kingdom looks like in practice. These are not two separate requests. They are one request, breathed in two directions. On earth as it is in heaven. In the ancient Jewish world, Heaven and earth were not opposites. They were two dimensions of the same reality. Heaven was where God's purposes were already fully enacted. Earth was where they had not yet fully arrived. The prayer is asking for the distance between those two dimensions to close. Not someday. Now. Give us this day our daily bread. We have already met the word ipiousios, the almost untranslatable Greek word behind daily. The word Origen in the 3rd century had never seen anywhere else. What we add here is simpler. Whatever ipiousios precisely means. The petition is structured around a single day, not a year, not a lifetime. Today, anyone familiar with the story of manna in the book of Exodus would have heard an echo immediately. God provides bread from heaven for the people in the wilderness. Each day, enough for that day. The instruction is explicit. Do not keep any until morning. Trust that tomorrow will bring tomorrow's portion. The people who tried to hoard it found that it's spoiled. The Lord's Prayer may be asking its practitioners to return to that posture every single day, to resist the accumulation that feels like security, to ask for today's bread today, and to come back tomorrow and ask again. Open hands. Every morning. That is the practice the prayer is asking for. Not a petition, a posture. Forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. Here is where the two gospel versions diverge most visibly. Matthew uses ophelemata, debts, concrete, economic, the kind of word you use when someone owes you something specific and real. Luke uses hamartias, sins, more theological, more immoral, the language of confession. Why the difference? Many scholars believe both versions are reaching toward the same Aramaic word, hoba, and hoba does not divide neatly into a single English meaning. It can mean debt in the financial sense. It can mean moral obligation. It can mean guilt. It can mean sin in a relational sense, something owed between persons that has not been paid. Matthew preserved the concrete, relational dimension. Luke clarified it in the direction of the explicitly theological. Both are legitimate responses to the same underlying word. Neither is complete without the other. What this tells us is that the petition operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Not just the abstract forgiveness of sin as a theological category. Something more concrete. A debt owed between people. A weight in a relationship that needs to be released. And then the condition. As we forgive our debtors. This is the only petition in the Lord's Prayer that comes with a condition attached. Every other request is made without qualification. But this one binds the asking to a corresponding action. The forgiveness being requested and the forgiveness being extended are placed in the same breath. Not as a transaction, as a recognition. You cannot genuinely ask to be released from what you owe while refusing to release others from what they owe you. In the Semitic structure of the prayer, these two halves are meant to be heard as one movement. They are inseparable, and the prayer will not let you forget that. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. This petition consistently gets heard in a way that is smaller than what it may be asking. The Greek word pyrasmos, translated as temptation, covers a range of meaning. At one end, a personal moral temptation. At the other end, something much larger, trial, testing, the kind of ordeal that has the capacity to overwhelm a person or a community entirely. Joseph Fitzmyer, whose work on the Aramaic background of the New Testament remains a standard reference, has noted that the corresponding Aramaic word tends toward this larger meaning in the literature of the period. Not a small test, a trial of the kind that could break you. Hear the petition through that lens. Lead us not into temptation becomes a petition about the limits of human endurance. Do not take us where we cannot stand. Do not let the trial come that is beyond what we are able to face. First-century Jewish people who prayed this prayer lived in an occupied land under a colonial power. They knew what breaking looked like. The prayer carried the weight of that reality. But deliver us from evil. The Greek word poneros can mean evil in the abstract. It can also mean the evil one. Christian communities across history have read it both ways. The Syriac tradition uses a word that holds both meanings simultaneously, leaving the ambiguity intact rather than resolving it in one direction. Both readings share this. The prayer ends not with confidence in human strength, but with an acknowledgement of human vulnerability. We cannot navigate the worst of what the world contains on our own. We need to be led away from it. We need to be rescued from it. The prayer that opened with the reaching of a child toward a parent ends with the same honesty. We need help, not just with our daily needs, not just with our moral failures, with the deepest trials we might face. The intimacy of Abba at the beginning, the vulnerability of deliver us at the end. Everything between those two poles is the shape of a life that knows both where it comes from and what it actually needs. Chapter 5. The Syriac Witness. Everything we have done so far has worked with the Greek text. But there is another witness. Not a competing version, not a lost original. A witness. Something that stands alongside the Greek text and looks at the same prayer from a different angle. An angle that, because of the language it uses, brings certain things into a slightly clearer focus. That witness is the Syriac tradition. Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic, not a distant cousin, a close relative. The language spoken by the Christian communities of Syria and Mesopotamia who received the gospel in the early centuries of the faith. Communities that did not need the gospel translated into Greek first, because they were already living in a Semitic world, already thinking and praying in a language from the same family as the one Jesus used. The principal Syriac Bible is called the Peshitta. The word means the simple or the common. The Peshitta is not a fringe document, not a modern reconstruction. It is an ancient and continuously living scriptural tradition, in unbroken use by Syriac Christian communities for somewhere between 17 and 19 centuries. Communities in Iraq, in Syria, in southern India, in diaspora congregations across the United States and Europe, read from it today in exactly the language their ancestors used. When you hear the Lord's Prayer in Syriac, something shifts. The prayer opens with the words, Abun Dvashmaya, our Father who is in heaven. And even if you do not know a single word of Syriac, something in the sound of those words is different from our Father, who art in heaven. Not better, not more correct, different. The texture of the language itself carries a quality that Greek and English, for all their precision and beauty, do not carry in quite the same way. The Peshitta is a translation. Like the Greek, it does not give us the exact words Jesus spoke. But because Syriac belongs to the same language family, because it shares grammatical structures and vocabulary roots with the Aramaic of first-century Palestine, It sometimes illuminates the Greek text in ways that go from language to language differently than Greek to Latin or Latin to English. Think of it this way. If you want to understand what a piece of music sounded like before it was arranged for piano, and the original recording is lost, hearing it arranged for a closely related instrument, something from the same family, played in the same tuning system, gives you a different kind of access than hearing it arranged for an entirely different instrument altogether. Not the original, but a closer echo. The Peshitta is a closer echo. Now, before we go further, we need to make an important distinction. There are two very different conversations about Aramaic and the Lord's Prayer, and conflating them does a disservice to both. The first conversation is the one we have been having: textual scholarship, historical linguistics, the careful, bounded work of asking what the Greek text may reflect about an Aramaic original, based on what we know about Aramaic grammar, Jewish prayer literature of the period, and the Syriac transmission of the text. This conversation has limits. It is honest about those limits, and within those limits, it produces genuine insight. The second conversation is different. It is contemplative and devotional, a tradition of reading the Aramaic roots of words, not primarily to establish historical meaning, but to open up a space for prayer and meditation, to let the resonances of an ancient Semitic language expand the way a familiar text is experienced in the present. These two conversations are not enemies, but they are not the same conversation, and knowing which one you are in matters. The most widely known voice in the second conversation is a scholar and teacher named Neil Douglas Klotz, whose book, Prayers of the Cosmos, published in 1990, introduced many readers to the possibility of hearing the Lord's Prayer through Aramaic roots. His work has had a genuine influence on many people's prayer lives. The expanded readings he offers for phrases like "Our Father" have opened the prayer in new directions for people who felt the traditional translation had gone flat for them. But Douglas Klotz is working in the contemplative tradition. His translations are not, and he does not claim them to be, what a mainstream Aramaic linguist would recognize as a critical translation. He is asking a different question. Not what did this word mean in first century Aramaic, but what resonances can this Aramaic root open up for someone who is praying today? That is a legitimate question. It belongs to a real and valuable tradition of devotional reading, but it is not the same as historical reconstruction. Both conversations have their place. The scholarly conversation establishes the ground. The contemplative conversation explores what can grow there. The mistake is treating them as interchangeable. What the Syriac tradition, considered as a scholarly witness, actually gives us is more modest and more genuinely interesting than what the devotional readings sometimes promise. When the Peshitta opens the Lord's Prayer with Abun Davashmaya, it uses a word for Our Father that carries within its structure the same root as Abba. The intimacy is built into the grammar. You cannot say the word without it. In Greek, Pater Heman is accurate. In Syriac, Abun is accurate and warm in a way that is structural, not merely tonal. When the Peshitta reaches the petition about forgiveness, it uses a word that holds together debt and sin and moral obligation in exactly the way that scholars believe the Aramaic Hoba did. It does not have to choose between Matthew's debts and Luke's sins. It carries both at once, because the language allows it to. When the Peshitta reaches the final petition, It uses a word that holds the same deliberate ambiguity that scholars believe the original may have carried. Evil as force, evil as person. The prayer does not resolve it. The language does not force a resolution. These are not dramatic revelations. They are quiet ones. The kind that do not overturn what you already knew, but settle more deeply into it. There are Christians in Iraq today who have prayed this prayer in Syriac since before the English language existed, before the King James Bible, before the Latin Mass became the standard of Western Christianity. They have been saying Abun Devashmaya in an unbroken line that stretches back toward the world this prayer came from. That is not a small thing. It does not give them a direct line to the exact words Jesus spoke. No living community has that. But it gives them a texture, a sound, a feel of the language the prayer was born near. And for a prayer that has traveled as far as this one has, that kind of continuity is remarkable. We started on a hillside in Galilee. A small group of people, a question, and an answer given in Aramaic, in a language that no surviving manuscript of this prayer was ever written in. From that moment, the prayer began its journey into Greek, carried by communities trying to reach a wider world, into manuscripts copied by hands we will never know, into the arguments of scholars over a single word that Origen in the 3rd century had never seen anywhere else, into Latin, into English, into the mouths of people who understood it deeply, and people who said it only out of habit, and people who said it for the first time in a hospital room, not knowing what else to say. So let us answer the question we began with. What happens to a prayer when it travels from a living voice into translation, tradition, and memory? Some things survive the journey with remarkable faithfulness. The structure of the prayer, the movement from closeness to praise, to urgency, to need, to honesty, survives every translation. The intimacy of the opening survives. Even if Abba carries a texture that Father cannot always hold, the urgency of Thy kingdom come survives. Even when the full weight of Malkutha gets softened, the honesty of lead us not into temptation survives. Even when Nisayon, the trial that could break you, does not always come through, the skeleton of this prayer is intact. Across 2,000 years of translation. That is extraordinary. And some things become harder to hear. The Semitic parallelism. 2 lines breathing together as one thought. Sometimes disappears in prose translation. The full weight of Hoba, holding debt and sin and obligation together, get split into 2 different English words in 2 different gospel versions. The deliberate ambiguity of the final petition sometimes gets resolved by translators who feel that clarity serves better than ambiguity. These are not failures. They are the inevitable costs of crossing from one language to another. Every translator pays them. Jerome paid them. Tyndale paid them. You cannot carry everything across. You make the best choices you can, and the prayer keeps moving. What did not happen is this. The prayer did not lose its power in translation. 14 centuries of Christians praying in Latin found it sufficient. Centuries of English-speaking Christians praying in the King James Version found it sufficient. Christians praying in Mandarin and Swahili and Portuguese and 1,000 other languages found it sufficient. Something in this prayer persists through and across the choices translators make. Something that does not depend on any single word being rendered perfectly. Call it the shape of the prayer, the way it moves, from intimacy to praise, to urgency, to need, to honesty. That shape is durable in a way that individual word choices are not. And knowing what we now know, something about where the words came from and what they may have carried in their original world, does not replace that shape. It deepens it. When you say Our Father now, you may hear underneath it something of Abba, the reaching of a child, not distance, closeness, beginning there. When you say Thy kingdom come, you may hear the urgency of Malkutha, not someday, now. When you say Forgive us our debts, you may hear the full weight of Hoba, not just the abstract forgiveness of sin, the release of something owed between persons. When you say, Lead us not into temptation, you may hear an honest acknowledgement of human limitation. Do not take us where we cannot stand. The prayer survived, and it is still being said. If you grew up saying this prayer, I want to invite you to try something. Say it tonight, slowly, not as recitation, as if you are saying it for the first time, with what you now know standing behind the words. And I would genuinely like to know which phrase, after today, sounds different to you than it did before we started. Leave it in the comments. I read every one, and the conversations that happened there, the honest ones, the searching ones, those are some of the most valuable things this kind of work produces. Because a prayer this old, that has traveled this far, does not belong only to scholars. It belongs to the people who say it, who have always said it, in every language, in every century, with open hands,